Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone here today. We have a couple more people coming in. We'll let them get in here. Okay, let's get started with a word of prayer. Jason, Lena, would you lead us in a word of prayer, please?
Dear righteous Heavenly Father, we bow our heads this morning to thank you for this beautiful morning. Thank you for this opportunity to be here and to worship you and study from your word. We ask that you would bless us, clear any distraction from our mind, and we pray that you be with the teachers as they deliver your message. May they do it accurately. We pray, Father, for those that are not here because of illness or injury or spiritual health issues. We pray that you guide them, strengthen them, and return them to us. It would be your will in Christ's name.
Amen. Thank you. Open up your Bibles to Acts chapter 17. We'll keep going there this morning. And we're on Paul's second missionary journey. And we've been on this run of very well-known city. Joe, move that forward for me once, will you? Let's go to the map. There we go. And we've been on this run of very familiar cities with us, very familiar stories. These are some of the best stories at the back half of the book of Acts. We read about Paul in Philippi, where he converted the Philippian jailer along with Lydia. And then after that, he moved over to Thessalonica. And in Thessalonica, remember it said, and there were some that believed. And he had some heavy opposition in Thessalonica, as well as Philippi. Got run out of Thessalonica, went to Berea. And in Berea, of course, it's just right down here. We remember that very famous statement about the Bereans were more noble-minded. And it says, and many became followers at Berea. And really, of course, Paul's, it's his M.O. When he comes to a city, he goes into the synagogue, he starts preaching to the Jews. And so that's what we're talking about. There's always Gentiles mixed in, but he starts in the synagogue. And in Thessalonica, remember it said he preached 3 Sabbaths in a row. And then finally had some believers and then met some opposition. But when he went to Berea, boom, right away, it said they really dove into the scripture to see if these things were true. That's how God defines a noble-minded person. And I think it was the Jews at Thessalonica eventually came over and caused trouble in Berea. And that's when Paul went from Berea. They got him out of there. I think it was even by night. And he sailed down to Athens. And that's where we're at now. And by the way, after Athens, we're going to leave Athens and we're going to go over to Corinth. Another very well-known city that has a couple books written to it. And so we see Paul is starting churches in all of these places right now that are going to be successful, and he's going to end up writing and communicating with these churches throughout the rest of the New Testament. So let's see. Let's pick up where I got to try to remember where we left off. So Paul came into Athens, and that starts in verse 16. And notice this, it says, in verse 16, now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, and he's waiting for Silas and Timothy because he called for them to come down with him. And while he was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he was observing a city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. So, we can all picture this. I mean, it's still a very famous place, and all of these idols and all of these temples, they're all still there in Athens. And we understand, the whole Western civilization history, and how influential Greek culture was, and really how idolatrous Greek culture was. And all of their gods and all of their stories are still so famous to us today. I mean, if you say Zeus, everyone knows who you're talking about, isn't it? Everyone knows what Zeus is and what all those Greek gods were. And we were talking a little bit about that last week. And just imagine yourself in Athens, just in that heyday, where you had Greek philosophy kind of dominating the world at that point. So much so that when the Romans defeated them, they just sort of adopted all of that ideology and all those gods and all that way of life. They just kind of adopted it and said, hey, we like that part of your culture. We'll take that. And if you were in Athens at this day and time, what did you think about yourself, your city, your people, versus everyone else in the world? We're smarter than you guys. We're superior to you guys. Even though the Romans are in control, we're the smartest people on the planet. And they thought they were the smartest people to ever be on the planet. And scientifically, they figured out some pretty interesting things. They were pretty smart. But when it came to spiritual ideas, they were the dumbest people on the planet. But that's not what they thought, was it? And so they had just incredible temples and statues, and the place was just full of idols, to the point where it says Paul's spirit was provoked seeing all of this. He couldn't stand it, and he was going to have to talk about it and preach about it. And so we see something that we don't always see said about Paul. We always see that it being said he went to the synagogue. But we don't always see it said that every day outside of that day in the synagogue, he was in the marketplace preaching and teaching. So he just is full bore going at it. And then we talked a little bit about how the Epicureans and the Stoics came and were debating with him, and then they gave him a platform on Mars Hill at a place called the Areopagus. They wanted Paul to come up and basically teach his story, teach the gospel at the Areopagus, because look in verse 21, it says, now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling and hearing something new. So they loved this. They loved the idea, hey, let's bring a guy in, let's listen to him talk. We'll accept him or reject him. We'll keep what we like and kick the rest out. That's kind of how they were. It was, I kind of jokingly said it's got like a college campus vibe to it. It's like, hey, bring everybody in and let them talk. Although that's not really how college campuses are anymore. That's how they used to be. So last week we got right up to this point where Paul is about to start his sermon in the Areopagus on Mars Hill. Now, before we start in on that sermon, I thought, let's talk for a couple minutes about idols. Jay, I'm going to put you on the spot. Just give me some kind of a definition off the top of your head for what an idol is. When I say idol, what do you think? I know I'm totally putting you on the spot, but just spit something out. It's going to be good.
It's humans' attempt to explain something in nature.
Okay. Some natural thing that they see.
Some power that they can't explain, and they attribute it to a god.
Okay, so when they see lightning, they go, well, I don't know how lightning works, so let's just attribute it to Zeus. And then they end up sort of worshiping this thing. Is idolatry in the Greek culture, was it different or the same as you might read about idolatry in the Old Testament with the Baals and things like that? Would it be different or the same, or are the fundamentals the same but the particulars different? Is that a good way to think about it? at its fundamental level, what is idolatry? Go ahead, Chris. Something that you put in place of God. Go ahead, Irene.
Actually, sometimes they say it's God, but they need an image to worship.
Okay, all right. So they're claiming this is a God, and we've created an image, and we're going to worship this thing.
And I think that was like the Ten Commandments. I think it was the second one, or the first one, where it says, "You will not make an image of me, a likeness of me."
No other gods before me. That's right. Go ahead, Roy.
I've always said that an idol is anything that comes between you and God.
Okay. An idol is anything that comes between you and God. Now, I'm glad you said that, Roy, because I think sometimes we have this kind of this narrow definition of an idol, whereas it's like some hunk of carved stone or wood or something, and we literally bow down to it and worship it, which is completely ludicrous. You just made this thing, and now you're going to bow down and worship? I mean, it's not even, there's nothing logical about that. But then Roy's definition is a little bit more broad. Anything that would come between you and God. So like money. Yeah, and I think sometimes we sort of struggle and we sort of think about both of those two ideas as idols to God, but we don't necessarily equate those two things so much, do we? I just wanted us to think about those two things, and you just think in your own mind, how broad of a definition do you have in your mind of what an idol is? And in the Old Testament, it was just completely bananas that they would just, hey, let's collect a bunch of gold, let's melt it down, turn it into a calf, and then let's bow down and worship it. That's just bananas. But they were doing it. And then you have Molech, another god. They were worshiping and they were burning children on the idol of Molech. I mean, you can't even really relate with that, right? What is that?
Well, they still do it in India with the Buddha.
What do they do in India with the Buddha?
They worship.
How?
Lights, incense, and stuff. They worship cows.
So I took that picture a couple weeks ago. So that is in someone's front yard over in the Bay Area. And that is a 4.5 foot tall head of Buddha. And there's two, Joe's fixing the image, trying to blow it up a little bit. There's two small ones right here, and then a big one right here in the middle, and it's all lit up and stuff like that. That got my attention so much, I had to stop and take a picture of it. That's some yard art right there. That's bizarre. I don't know much about Buddhism. I've looked into it, studied it a little bit. I'm not sure they're necessarily bowing down to Buddha or they're bowing down to the concepts that Buddha has espoused when he was alive. But whatever the case, that's sort of an idol in the oldest sense that we can think of, huh? We got a carved out hunk of rock sitting on the front lawn. And it's not common that you see a 4.5 foot head on people's lawn over there, but it's pretty common to see images like that. And do we have idols floating around America today? There's a floating head in someone's front yard. Go ahead.
Well, I think even more realistic is we can even idolize people to the point where we put our faith, our trust, or, like you said, money, activities.
Yeah.
Anything that we put above God.
Yeah.
think that's
Yeah.
going to solve our problem.
Yeah.
Is really a type of idol.
Yeah. Yeah, what Ginger said is we idolize people sometimes. And it's funny that she said that. I was thinking of that too. I mean, just look at how, not necessarily how we would look at them, but look at how the world looks at the biggest entertainers. I mean, man. There is activity that you see by some people aimed towards entertainers that you think, oh boy, this is crossing a line. It's more than hero worship. It's envy, they just look at them and want what they have, and they want to be like them, and they'll almost do anything to get some fame. And maybe fame and wealth is the real idol there, and they're envious of those people that have achieved that kind of thing. But that's been going on for a long time. You can find old black and white clips of people just absolutely losing their minds when the Beatles step off the plane. It's been going on for a long time. Go ahead, Jay.
So the Buddha head represents Buddhist teaching, right?
Uh-huh.
It's an emblem, it's a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
Like our American flag is a symbol
Mm-hmm.
for the Republic. And we say a pledge to it.
Mm-hmm.
So can that be considered an idol?
Well, maybe that depends on where you list it within your life. You know what I mean? What do you think?
I think it quite possibly can be.
It can be. Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
I don't necessarily disagree that anything you put before God is considered an idol, but those are not the examples we see of idolatry in the Old Testament or even the New Testament.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the flag, it's a symbol of things that we hold true to. Whereas these guys, it was trying to explain the unexplainable. Almost the way that I would say a rabbit's foot is closer to an idol today.
Oh, what is?
A rabbit's foot.
Oh, yeah.
If you rub that, good things are going to happen.
Yeah.
Because that's things you can't explain. Where if I'm chasing after the Raiders, I really like them, but they're not my idol.
Right.
And so I think we have to kind of go back and look at the context of what really idolatry was. It went to explain lightning. It went to explain the harvest. It went to explain fertility. The stuff you have no control over. And so I just think we got to be careful about trying to apply modern day things to idolatry.
Yeah. Okay, you've made me think of in sort of a certain vein. I think you're really onto something here. Because I'm trying to decide, how do I really define an idol too? Go ahead. A cross. Okay, let's talk about that in just a second. So, back to this thought of explaining things that you can't explain. I think in every case of some of these idols that we see during the time of Paul in Athens and things like that, and even if you go back into the Old Testament, hey, think of the golden calf. So the children of Israel were just delivered from the land of Egypt by God. And then they make this golden calf, and they start giving the calf the credit. Maybe the right definition of an idol is when God does something for his people, and we turn around and give the credit to something else, idolatry. Maybe at its core, maybe that's like the common thread into all things that are really idolatrous. And, let's just think about money, If you're comfortable, you're well off, you're this and that, and you don't give God the credit for all the monetary blessings that you have, you just look at, yourself, your wealth, your bank account, and you give the credit for your own security and safety to your bank account rather than giving the credit to God who's taking care of you. That's, I think, you're crossing the line. And God claims throughout the Bible that he is a jealous God. He gives you something. He takes care of you in every way, and then you turn around and give credit to someone else or something else. Won't that make you mad? Maybe at the crux, that's it. Okay, let's go back to the cross. Amy asked the question. Go ahead.
So, a lot of denominations, specifically Catholics, that's when they have the rosary with the cross on the end and all of those things, is that I know that they believe very differently from us, but would that be considered an idol? Because they literally cling to that when they are sad, scared, any of those things. They don't cling to Jesus.
Yeah.
They cling to God.
Yeah.
So would the cross be in the yard be very similar to that, or would it just be a reminder?
I've never thought about the cross as being an idol to some people, but hey, I'm open to your thoughts and ideas. I've always thought of as the cross as being maybe something that was emphasized in an improper fashion. You know, what kind of emphasis did God put on the cross itself? The very image of the cross. No, God never set up any glory that would go towards that image or anything like that. All of the glory goes to Jesus and to Him. Now, people would say, oh yeah, but the cross is reminding me of Jesus. Okay.
But it's almost a whitewash of what happened, because if you show the true representation of the cross, it'd be Jesus on the cross, nailed to the cross, which is kind of a gory image.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a whitewash of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. What are your thoughts about the cross? I know in this room there's going to be some pretty strong feelings one direction or the other. Some people would never wear a cross. And some people would have no problem wearing a cross, on a chain as a necklace or something like that. And I personally don't have a problem with it either. But what you think and what motivates you matters to God. Go ahead.
If you think back to Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness, they lifted it up. Anybody that looked at it lived. They kept the serpent. It was a thing of brass. They kept it, but they did not worship it.
Uh-huh.
Later on, they started to serve it. I mean, they treated it like an idol, and
Yeah.
then it had to be destroyed.
Yeah.
When you're talking about what makes an idol, the idea of what you are serving makes a difference. Sometimes we say, well, money is an idol. Well, why would we call it that? Jesus says you cannot serve God and mammon. It's an idol because it serves. Anything that I serve is an idol, whether you're talking about something like that, as a wallet, or an entertainer, or fishing or golf, or whatever. Really, an idol is a physical representation of a spiritual concept. There's a being out there. We represent it with an idol. We bow down to the idol. We serve it. I can serve the idol. I can serve money. I can bow down to the crucifix.
Yeah.
And treat the crucifix like the Israelites treated the brass serpent.
Yeah.
It's what you serve that makes the idol.
It's probably a great parallel, the idea of the brass serpent and the cross. And how are you viewing it? How are you using it? That's probably a very good parallel. But anyways, I thought it's worthwhile just stopping and talking about this for a second. I mean, just think about in our country, we have things like this. We have... I thought about putting pictures up there of like the Mormon temple, the Vatican, a mosque. I mean, we have all these temples and places where people are going and worshiping all the wrong things. The more you think about it, the more you realize our country is Athens. It's everywhere. There are improper religious things all over the place. And there are places, and probably more or less cities you could go to where your spirit would probably be provoked at things you see. And so I say all that just because we're about to read Paul's sermon to the Athenians. And of all the sermons that we've looked at in Acts, this one I felt like probably would be maybe the best template for us preaching a sermon today. We are in a very similar situation. You know, we're not going to a synagogue preaching to Jewish audience. We're preaching to an audience much like the Athenians. And so watch how Paul goes at this sermon, and watch for, the logic that he uses, the persuasive tools and buttons that he uses. I think it's something that would be helpful to us as we talk to people today. But, like it was Jay or Joe said last week, you always got to meet people kind of where they are. And people are at different places all the time. You got to figure out. That's why a good quick conversation about what people think and what people believe right in the beginning is very important. You got to figure out where they are, and so where you can start conversing and reasoning with people. Okay, so let's go to any other thoughts or comments about that before. Okay, let's see. Bub, why don't you read for us? Last week we read verse 22 and 23. 22 and 23 says, "So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with an inscription to the unknown God. Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you.'" We read that right at the end last week and talked about how that is the opening and the hook. The opening meaning he compliments them and says, you're very religious. You're thinking about God. And then you've got this one idol to an unknown God. I'm going to tell you about that one. And then he starts in on his sermon. So let's see. Bub, take off in verse 24 and go down through verse 31 for us.
The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. They would seek God. Then perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are also his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead.
Okay. I sometimes I can't help it. Just look at the last verse 31, the last line. This is sort of like Paul's final punch. And notice what he emphasizes, because he, meaning God, has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. Proof? We always talk about proof, huh? Can you prove that God exists? Can you prove that Jesus existed? Can you prove that he was raised from the dead? Can you prove that the gospel is really from God? Well, Paul used the word proof, didn't he? We always kind of shy away from it too, don't we? Well, I don't know, I can't quite prove it, but I can give you a lot of evidence. Paul didn't shy away from the word, did he? He said, God proved something to you by raising Jesus from the dead. Now, these are Athenians. Did they see Jesus raised from the dead? They never saw it. Does that negate the fact that it is proof? And if there was any time where you would want to come at a group of people and say proof, the Greek culture, that's what you're going to come at them with. They just pride themselves on their logic and their thought process and what they can prove and not prove. Paul says, well, I'll show you some proof. God raised Jesus from the dead. Refute that. I don't know, I love that as a final line. But now, let's go back up to the top and where Paul really starts. What are some things to you that might stand out in this sermon? What do you think he really comes at them with, other than that final, the proof is Jesus raised from the dead. What else does he use on the way there? Maybe I ask it like this. Paul talks about God and what God has done. And don't you think that is in contrast to what they think a God is? What would be the contrast? This God made the world and everything in it. Everything? Yeah. Now, think about sort of this Greek culture. They have a God for one of everything. They have a God for the night, a God for the day, a God for the land, which they called Gaia, by the way. She still hangs around in America somehow. We hear kooks talk about Gaia all the time. I mean, they have a God that shoots lightning bolts, a God of war, a God of love, a God of this, a God of wine. I mean, they have God for everything. But Paul comes in and says, I just have one. He made everything. So this whole litany of gods that you have, nope. This one did it all. Go ahead, Chris.
But he also doesn't insult it in that sense either, because he even says, your own poets have said, we are also his children.
Yeah. That's right. He pointed out something that they believe. You understand that we came from God. Therefore, this is how you should be thinking. And so, does anyone know, sort of the creation legend within the Greek culture? I don't know that I really know it all that well. I know a little bit. Most cultures, whether it's Egyptian, Greek, or something like that, they rarely have a good explanation for how the universe came into existence. They all kind of struggle with that. And most of them, for the most part, Greek philosophy just kind of thought, well, matter's just always been here. And there were a couple gods that did some things and started some things, and it's very murky how things sort of came about at its origin. But, Paul says in verse 24, the God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and of earth, he does not dwell in temple made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needs anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. Now, think about each one of those statements. I probably have them. So God made the heavens and the earth. That's in a pretty stark contrast to, what anything that Zeus did or something like that. God gives life and breath and all things. And then God made every nation to seek Him. There was a couple other things in here. Let's see. He does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He served by human hands. When you think about sort of the idea of Greek gods, do Greek gods, did they have their temples that they lived in? Are they looking to be served by humans times? Yeah. I mean, they would come down and interact with humans and misbehave with humans. The Greek god concept was so humanistic in nature. And yet Paul's drawing this contrast between what they think of as a god and the real God. He's totally different. He doesn't run around misbehaving with people and doing things out of greed or lust or conceit or anything like that. He's above all of that. And this idea that God made every nation, well, I haven't even read that. I think it's in verse 26. Verse 26 says, "And He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and boundaries of their habitations." Okay, now that sounds kind of big, isn't it? What do you think that means? Having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitations. Say that again, Bill.
How long a nation will exist as a nation.
Oh,
They'll always, through time, conquer and be conquered.
yeah,
And be conquered.
yeah. I'd say the Greek concept of sort of how the world works is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, chaos was a big concept in their worldview and in how they thought of things. They thought it was chaos in the beginning. That's kind of how the universe started out, just chaos. And then we had a couple big gods sort of bring some order to the chaos. And then throughout time, there's a lot of chaos that takes place. And the gods will come down at times and sort of put their hands in things and move things around. And their sort of worldview is fairly chaotic. Good things happen, we don't really know why, or God must have found favor in what we were doing, or disfavor in what we were doing. But again, stark contrast to Jehovah. He's in control of everything. He set the boundaries. He's determining when nations rise and fall. He's in total control of all of this. Very different to their gods. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if you make a parallel, in Ephesians 3, God had an eternal purpose. Where spiritual matters were concerned, He laid it out in advance. He knew which way it was going to go, what He was going to accomplish. You can make the case here that He did the same thing where the material universe was concerned. He had a plan where spiritual matters were concerned. He had a plan where, what's the right word? Where history was going. He had His hand in it. It wasn't chaos. This is planned out. An idea I would bring in here, in the spiritual realm, yes, God had a plan that He accomplished. He mapped it out and did it. Doesn't mean we don't have free will.
Mm-hmm.
In the physical realm, likewise, He mapped it out. He'll accomplish it. Doesn't mean man can't misbehave and have free will. It works the same way in both the material and the physical universe.
Yeah, that's a pretty good thought, and it probably is in pretty stark contrast to this Greek idea that God is guiding the world, and we as individuals operate within God's overarching plan. This is how God has control of the direction of everything, and yet we still have free will within that. It's a little different in the Greek philosophy, the Greek idea. I wanted to pause on something right here too. God made every nation to seek Him, and He is not far. This is a point that Paul makes. Isn't it kind of silly does it strike you as weird to say, He's not far? He's right there. What the Greeks think about their gods. They're up on Mount Olympus. We can't make it to them. We can't get to them. We are completely at the disposal of their whim, whether they come down and interact with us or not. It's all based on what do they want to do with us. But that's in contrast to what Paul is teaching. Paul's teaching God made men to seek Him, and He's not far. Meaning, you can find Him. There is something that you can do. You can approach God in this system. Not really sure that was true in their system. Could they go to a temple and pray? Sure, and they did. They went to temples and prayed to hunks of rock. But still, ultimately, it was up to the God whether they wanted to come down and interact with people or not. I just think it's interesting contrasts throughout Paul's sermon with Greek ideas. Okay, let's see. Let's keep going. There was a couple other things. Okay, what do you make of this one? I haven't read it yet. Verse 38. For in Him we live and move and exist. Okay. I don't know. Does that sound like, what does that mean? Is that just platitudinous talk? In Him we live and move and exist. I don't know. Why would you put that in your own words? What does it mean to be in Him? Say that again, Phyllis. He gave us breath. Okay, He can take the breath away. So He literally can bring us life or death. Yeah? God is omnipresent. And that's in pretty good contrast to their gods and their ideas, huh?
We live within the boundaries that He's allowed.
We live within the boundaries, the physical boundaries that God has placed for us. Yeah? I mean, if you were to say, I exist in God, what does that mean? I think there's a similar statement. Where is it? Turn over to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1 is talking about Jesus, giving a lot of attributes about Jesus and really demonstrating how much power Jesus has. This is just verse 16 and 17. I think it's a very similar statement. Verse 16 says, For by Him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through Him and for Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. What does that mean, that all things hold together by Jesus? What would happen to this universe if Jesus decided not to hold all things together? I guess it would fly apart, one molecule by another, I guess. Maybe I'm thinking too physical, but that's always kind of what I've thought about. I mean, this universe it's like a giant, perfectly functioning clock. It's about as complicated as you can get, and something had to design it and hold it together. And Colossians said, well, that's what Jesus did. Stark contrast to the Greek idea, wouldn't it be? I mean, that's a pretty bold, powerful statement. In Him we exist. I don't think the Greeks would think they were dependent on God to exist. But that's what Paul's saying. You wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for Him. A couple other big points that he makes. We are His children. Talked about that. Idols are made by men. And then his final statement, we've already kind of looked at a little bit. Let me go back. Acts chapter 17. We've already looked at where Paul says, because He has fixed a day. So we're talking about all these attributes of God, what He's like, how He created the universe, how He created us to seek Him, how He's not far, how everything that exists is because of Him. We are completely dependent. Our existence is dependent upon Him. And He has fixed a day in which He will judge all people. Now, would that, I don't care how Greek you are, that would get your attention. Oh, there's going to be a judgment day where this God will judge all of us. They got to be wondering based on what? He's going to judge us, but for what? And he says, He will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom He has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising Him from the dead. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, and others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom also were Dionysius and Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So Paul had some success in Athens. He has some people following him after this. Maybe not as much as Berea or some of the other cities, but he had some success. And then from here, he's going to leave and go to Corinth, and that's where we'll pick up next week.